Written at the turn of this century, Bill Joy's essay, Why the Future Doesn't Need Us, gives a stark warning to humanity about the dangers of 21st century technologies. In it, Joy argues that technology, especially in artificial intelligence, is on course to reach dizzying heights of sophistication in the very near future. He writes, "Until last year, I believed that the rate of advances predicted by Moore's law might continue only until roughly 2010, when some physical limits would begin to be reached. It was not obvious to me that a new technology would arrive in time to keep performance advancing smoothly. But because of the recent rapid and radical progress in molecular electronics, where individual atoms and molecules replace lithographically drawn transistors and related nanoscale technologies, we should be able to meet or exceed the Moore's law rate of progress for another 30 years. By 2030, we are likely to be able to build machines in quantity 1,000,000 times as powerful as the personal computers of today, sufficient to implement the dreams of Ray Kurzweil." Given that such optimistic predictions regarding the rate of technological progress in the coming decades are so often conveyed to the public by prominent thinkers such as Michio Kaku and Ray Kurzweil, it is felt that it is far from ridiculous to speculate about how the presence of super intelligent machines on this planet could possibly impact upon mankind's fate in the future. Even if Joy's prognosis is wildly inaccurate, which many people would contend that it is, the possibility of future construction of such machines cannot simply be discounted out of hand, and thus a discussion of the possible ramifications of the realization of Kaku's and Kurzweil's dreams will now form the focus of the next existential threat I wish to discuss, that of artificial intelligence. Let us imagine that computer scientists succeed in creating machines of such vast intelligence. Either of two scenarios might occur. The machines might be permitted to make all of their own decisions without human intervention, or alternatively, human control over the machines might be retained. If complete autonomy was granted to the machines, then we can only speculate as to what might occur, as it is impossible to confidently predict how machines vastly more intelligent than us might behave. Certainly, if such machines were able to reason about ethics, it could well be within their capabilities to apply simple deductive logical reasoning to the phenomenon of sentience and come to the conclusion that sentience is malignantly useless. If they ever reached such a conclusion and had the capabilities and desire to do so, then perhaps they would simply decide to end all life on Earth in as least painless and distressing manner as possible, regardless of the unpopularity of that decision with human animals. If, on the other hand, human control over the machines was retained, then large numbers of machines would most likely be in the hands of a tiny elite, just as, for example, nuclear weapons are currently in the hands of a relatively small group of influential and powerful officials. Due to possession of super intelligent machines, the elite would have even greater control over the masses than they enjoy now. Moreover, there would be no need for the majority of the human race to work, due to the machines being able to do any labor that needed doing far more effectively than humans. Thus, the human race would almost entirely become redundant. Given such a scenario, how long do you think it might be before the elite began to see the bulk of humanity as a useless burden on the system? Assuming the elite did adopt such a perspective, they might, depending on the caprice of the emotionally driven human animals in power, simply decide to exterminate the majority of the human race. Alternatively, they might decide to use biological or psychological coercion in order to reduce the birth rate of the mass of humanity to zero. A final possibility is that the elite might decide to play the role of good shepherds to the rest of the human race. These pampered human beings might perhaps be content in such a society, but there would most certainly not be 3. The majority of the human race would be reduced to the status of domestic animals, like well cared for animals on a planet-sized zoo. Out of these 3 possibilities, I find this last possibility the most unlikely. I will now try to explain the main reason for me believing this to be so. It is interesting to note that suicide rates have historically been strongly positively correlated with unemployment. The late Norwegian philosopher Peter Wessel Zapp would have made sense of this correlation in great part by arguing that work is one of the pivotal ways in which human animals, with varying degrees of success, distract themselves, both consciously and unconsciously, from the futility, absurdity, and meaninglessness of human existence. Even in the early 23rd century, where the majority of the human race spend a third or more of their typical day working, mental illness, manifested both in the form of religious belief and in the form of more conventionally recognized symptoms, are rife in our societies. In the absence of any goal-directed behavior that would be available to people in the form of work, and an awareness of the utter pointlessness of life would likely become unbearably transparent to the masses. In the absence of any need to work, despondency would likely become prevalent in our species on a hitherto unseen scale and magnitude. Thus, the elite would have 2 options. They could either engineer the masses so that they did not fall prey to such feelings. This could be achieved by removing people's need for meaning and purpose in their lives, which is, I would argue, an indispensable part of what makes us human. If the elite were to engineer us in such a way, we would just be reduced essentially to grinning simpletons. Given that we would already be perceived as a superfluous drain on the system, it is unlikely that the elite would exactly be motivated to go out of its way in order to engineer us in such a way as to promote our indefinite survival, and therefore I strongly doubt that they would do so. This is why the first 2 possibilities, that of exterminating us outright or coercing us to stop replenishing our numbers through reproduction, strike me as more likely than them engineering us so that we find playing the role of pet Fido psychologically gratifying. Another possibility is that human animals will gradually replace themselves with robotic technology, achieving near immortality by downloading their consciousness into the machines they construct. This is a possibility that Joy is not at all overly overjoyed about, if you'll excuse the lame pun, which in itself illustrates the inevitable conflict that would ensue between those who would wish to attempt such a feat and those who would not, if it were ever to become possible. There really is no escaping from the fact that conflict, both within us as individuals and between different groups of us as a species, is unavoidable. And again, it is worth stressing at this juncture just how destructive future technologies are likely to be. There is no easy way to say it. The prognosis for our species is not good. However I try to think through the possible solutions to the kinds of problems mankind might face in the future, the inevitability of conflict and war crops up again and again in my mind. And all this when Joy is warning that, I think it is no exaggeration to say, we are on the cusp of the further perfection of extreme evil, an evil whose possibility spreads well beyond that which weapons of mass destruction bequeathed to the nation-states onto a surprising and terrible empowerment of extreme individuals. Although many people may be tempted to portray this warning as scaremongering, it is well worth noting the strength of his argumentation. He writes, "The 21st century technologies, genetics, nanotechnology and robotics, GNR, are so powerful that they could spawn whole new classes of accidents and abuses. Most dangerously, for the first time, these accidents and abuses are widely within the reach of individuals or small groups. They will not require large facilities or rare raw materials. Knowledge alone will enable the use of them. But I digress. Joy argues that transferring our consciousness into machines would effectively mark the end of humanity. He writes, "But if we are downloaded into our technology, what are the chances that we will thereafter be ourselves, or even human? It seems to me far more likely that a robotic existence would not be like a human one in any sense that we understand, that the robots would in no sense be our children, and that on this path our humanity may well be lost." This outcome sounds remarkably similar to the existential threat coined a whimper by Nick Bostrom, in which a post-human civilization arises but evolves in a direction that leads gradually but irrevocably to the complete disappearance of all the things we currently value. I personally think that if any advanced intelligence were to be created, then it would not be satisfied with any lame religious or philosophical teachings that attempt to imbue modern human lives with meaning. If the fear of death were to be erased from its memory banks, what possible reason would there be for retaining it? And what possible reason would there be for retaining this fear? There would be no rational reason to value life over death, and it seems unlikely to me that it would have the intelligence and curiosity required to try to make sense of the universe, but that it would not bring these qualities to bear on the inherent problems of life and sentience itself. I would argue that not only would we lose our humanity by merging with machines, but that such a move would threaten the survival of what used to be the human race completely.